Well, thank you for watching, and I'm here with Esther Levens to my far right and JoAnn Magnuson in the middle. As I described in the opening segment, these two ladies were bonded together basically for their love for Israel. I'm going to ask Esther first. Esther, you two met in the early 90s, around maybe 90, through AIPAC. What's the acronym AIPAC stand for?
American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
Okay. And so now you two have bonded together all these years. What is keeping you two ladies together all these years?
I would say our love for Israel is
Mm-hmm.
keeping us together, and we keep asking ourselves and each other,
what are we doing?
What can we do that will make a difference, that will help Israel in terms of Hasbara, which is public relations, which they're not very adept at doing for themselves. So a few of us in the United States and around the world are in support of them and staunch support of them.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really fascinating with my entire adventure with JoAnn and more than 200 other organizations actually, was the fact that the Christians were so dedicated and so devout in terms of their love and affection for Israel and their willingness to just bend over backwards to help Israel in many, many ways.
Well, I recently finished a book called Friends Indeed, which is a history of American involvement in Israel. It's a really good book.
Really?
Yes.
Who's the author?
I think it was written by two people. They're both Jewish. I don't remember their names offhand. But it goes all the way back from prior to the Barbary Wars.
Yeah.
Initially, America's involvement in Israel was spiritual because it was the homeland of the Messiah for the Christians. And
well, the whole biblical covenant, I think, is a big thing in Christian understanding.
Right. And then once the birth of Israel came to place, it became more geopolitical, because they wanted to oppose the influence of Russia. So there were a lot of different reasons for America's involvement. Now, JoAnn, perhaps you can explain to us why Israel should be important to America.
Well, I think Israel should be important to America because as Christians, we share the Judeo-Christian worldview. The covenant that God made with Abraham, we believe, is still in force. And while many Christians lost track of that during the medieval period, when there was a lot of anti-Semitism and misunderstanding, as people were not really studying the Bible for themselves, a lot got lost in that period in the Middle Ages.
The Bible wasn't even in the vernacular of their own language during those times.
In many places that is true. And with the coming of the Reformation, which had weaknesses also to bear, but the text was then translated into the language of the common people, and particularly the English Bible had a huge influence on the thinking of people in the Western world. There's an interesting book by Barbara Tuchman called A Bible and Sword, which describes that whole relationship. And it's kind of she calls it the history of Zionism from the Bronze Age to Balfour. And I see myself and my heritage as part of that. I grew up thinking that the land of Israel was important not just because Jesus lived there, although that mattered, but the connection that we as the Jewish, or as the Christian people, have with the Jewish heritage and with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right, so, grafted into the tree of the root of Jesse.
Right.
Maybe, Esther, we have Jews and Gentiles, watching this show. I do a political show in Manchester through a spiritual kind of connection, and I'm also involved in a group in Manchester called Vision, which is a group of several different faiths of peoples who support Israel, and that's the objective, is to educate people in Israel. But if you were going to speak to a Jewish audience, what would you say to the Jewish audience why American Jewry should support Israel?
Well, to begin with, the fact that we're living in this time when Israel has been reborn is such a miracle that I don't know how anybody can ignore it. You know, to be part of this and not to be active in it, and actively try to help a new country. 62 years is not very old.
Right.
So, and they've needed so much help because of all the refugees that were taken in after the 1948 war. More recently, the Holocaust is a terrible, horrible example of the worst that can happen in Jewish-Christian relations, you might say. But, and anti-Semitism is now on the rise again.
No doubt.
And I think it's being fostered and inspired by the Islamic movement, this Islamist movement, and radical Islam, which people are reluctant to say politically, but our organization, the Unity Coalition for Israel, doesn't hesitate to take positions. And so basically, so many people adhere to political correctness that I think we're kind of a refreshing breeze blowing from the Middle East to the Midwest, or vice versa. Yeah.
Right. Now you're more like a facilitator, Unity Coalition, in that you bring in all sorts of organizations under one umbrella, right?
Exactly.
And so that website, that is a good, like a central hub for somebody who wants to go to get truthful information.
Absolutely. That is what we produce. That's our product, is information. And can I give our website?
Sure.
It's www.israelunitycoalition.org.
Okay.
And anybody who wants a free subscription to our daily newsletter can simply call or go into visit that site, and then just simply subscribe, and you'll get as much information as you want. We send it out every day, 5 days a week.
And now, JoAnn, you've been involved with Bridges for Peace.
I've been involved with practically all of the pro-Israel Christian organizations.
What's the organization you're a director of now?
Well, I'm actually not the director. I'm working with the organization in Jerusalem. Yad Vashem is the Holocaust Memorial and Education Center. I took their training program for Holocaust educators several years ago, and I'm currently working to connect American Christian educators with the facilities at Yad Vashem. That, among a number of things I'm doing. I've worked many times over the years with the International Christian Embassy, which is an excellent organization in Jerusalem. I've also worked with Bridges for Peace for many years. I'm currently doing a lot of consulting with CUFI, Christians United for Israel, which at the moment is really the largest organization in the U.S. of pro-Israel Christians. And of course I'm a long-time participant in the Unity Coalition, and Esther and I have been trying to micromanage the Middle East from the Middle West since the early 90s.
All this from Minnesota, and you're from Kansas, right? It's funny because I looked up your website's address in Kansas, and I did a Google, and it's the first time in my Google map never moved. It zoomed straight in, right straight down to your address. The map never had to move, so you're centrally located, that's for sure.
That's the middle of the country.
I have to try that.
Yeah, I've never seen it. Usually the map will turn just a hair. Yeah. Never straight down, right to your website.
What did you
Google Earth.
For the middle of the country, the precise middle of America.
Really?
Yeah, so I found that pretty interesting. I'm like, how come it's not moving? Does it, you know? So you have a special place in the heart of Google, that's for sure. Now,
we hope the special place in the heart of God is even more effective.
I hear you. Now, if you were going to speak to a Christian audience, now you've given like 60, you've gone to Israel like 60-something times, right?
I have.
You've given tours, or you just go there and so you give tours?
I've been leading Christian and interfaith groups to Israel since the 1970s. And I think it's very important for Christians to see the land, to meet the people. We don't do just Holy Land tours. The old saying is, you run today where Jesus walked. But we certainly do some of that, but we want people to see kind of beneath the surface. We want them to meet the kibbutzniks and the left wing and the right wing and the hippies on the beach in Tel Aviv and the Orthodox in Miasharim in Jerusalem and the biblical sites as well as the modern sites. I usually start my tours in a place in Tel Aviv called Independence Hall, where David Ben-Gurion proclaimed statehood on May 14th, 1948. Because I think we need to see it from the perspective of modern Israel, as well as the biblical perspective. They're all important, but we shouldn't emphasize one at the expense of the other.
Well, when I speak to people who question America's involvement in Israel, there always seems to be the same mantra: is why are we giving them money, which is essentially $2.5 billion a year, which you know, if I'm not mistaken, Israel uses that to maintain their heightened sense of security for defensive purposes, because there's so many threats from all different angles for their very survival. And yet they never bring up the fact that the Palestinians are getting equal or more that sum of money, not only from America, but from a coalition of a lot of other countries that have pledged to give to them.
Well, a great deal of the money that's been allocated over the years came about during the period when Sadat and Begin made the agreement, you know, to give, they say Israel was giving back the Sinai. I'm not sure back is the appropriate word, but anyway, Israel gave the Sinai to Egypt. And in return for that, there was money promised from the United States to support defense procedures both in Egypt and in Israel. The money that goes to Israel is primarily spent in America on buying hardware, security, military, strategic
the money's coming back to America, basically.
From America. But I don't think we should be ashamed of supporting Israel. We have to remember it's a little country, 50 miles wide, less than 300 miles north to south, and it's the bastion of democracy in the area. Is it perfect? Heavens, no. And neither is America. We've all lived here long enough to know we have faults and failings in our efforts to create a stable union and a democratic society, and Israel does too. But we don't have secret police spying on people. We don't have the situation they have in Iran. We don't have the situation that prevailed for years in the Soviet Union. People try to get into Israel and the United States. They're not trying to get out through fences that don't.
This is true. This is true.
And I think in order to preserve Western civilization, that's really what's at stake. We are being, and I don't in any way want to minimize the fact that there are good Muslims in the world, and we should try to have dialogue and understanding between those who. There's a wonderful film just out called The Third Jihad, which is narrated by a Muslim, an American Muslim, who is very concerned that his religion has been hijacked by Islamists and terrorists and people who think jihad is the main pillar of the faith.
Have you heard of Walid Shabat?
Oh yes, that's true, and I know him quite well.
Oh really? I met him. He's one of my
heroes. We met him before he became a public figure.
Really? Walid Shabat, if you don't know, he was a former Palestinian terrorist who completely changed and converted his ways and is a staunch supporter of Israel through his reading of the Tanakh. So, you know, if there's, you know, that's probably the best way to change people's hearts towards Israel, is to change their hearts towards the maker of the world, which I believe is, you know, a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, Esther, you and I were talking earlier about some of the double standard in the world toward Israel. For example, the United Nations resolutions against Israel are in the hundreds since 1968, 67.
1948.
Well, you're right. But if you look at, if you just do a Google of United Nations resolutions against Palestinians or Palestine or whatever, you're not going to find any. So, what's the deal with the United Nations? And I know you're working on something for November. Perhaps you can enlighten us a little bit there.
Well, the United Nations, you have to realize the Security Council is comprised of the worst offenders of human rights, and countries that have no human rights. So if they vote on a resolution, you can almost erase it because it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, if they were to confess their sins,
Right.
they would be far worse. So it's the Security Council is not secure.
That's for sure. Now, what's this organization that from the UN that is working on the Palestinian refugees?
Well, it's very interesting that in 1948, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was established to take care of all the world's refugees, the entire world, and except for the Palestinians. And the Palestinians had a special agency called UNRA that was assigned the task of making sure that they were maintained in the camps in deplorable conditions, with billions of dollars, 25% of which come from the United States, poured into the maintenance of these poor people who have no future. I mean, they have no employment, they live in deplorable conditions. And so an Israeli Rabbi Benny Alon, is very active in trying to get the Palestinians to be supported by this other organization, not UNRWA,
Right.
and whose responsibility it is to resettle the refugees. And that's what they need. And so that is what Benny Alon is committed to do, and he's asked the Unity Coalition for Israel to provide education and to publicity for this really terrible situation in which they find themselves. And it's really a terrific humanitarian need. It's not the Israelis who are oppressing the Palestinians. It is the Arab countries, none of the 21 Arab countries will permit Palestinians to become citizens.
No.
So they're kept as political ploys.
That's what I always assumed, that the Palestinian situation is kind of a red herring that they're using as an excuse to demonize Israel when they're not really doing anything to help solve it.
Right.
It's like it works in their benefit.
You know, it's a works project, it's an employment project, because there are 28,000 Palestinians employed to keep these people in camps and to maintain them with very little education and very little help and very few jobs, really. And can you imagine 28,000? The United States is pouring money into that.
To just keep people in essentially an overgrown chicken coop with fence all around it and keep them penned in.
And there are 59 camps.
59 refugee camps?
59 refugee camps that are maintained. So we want to get some of this information out, and we want to change. It's not that we want to withhold money, but we want to direct it where it will actually accomplish the goals that we think it's supposed to accomplish, which is resettling them and giving these people a life.
Well, isn't there something that America can do to put pressure on the surrounding nations to help absorb this refugee issue? Or?
I think that probably we could, if it weren't for one thing, and that's oil. And I think that we're reluctant to force them because they have the commodity that we need so desperately. So.
Right, which for me would be a rabbit trail, because I believe that the energy resources is a matter of national security, yet we refuse to be self-sufficient and reliant on other people.
Right.
And that kind of, it's kind of an Achilles heel for America.
One book I think we'd like to recommend that's been out for a few years now, but written by a friend of ours, Frank Gaffney, called War Footing, and it's 10 steps to put America and Western civilization on the path to a war footing, to understand that we are in a ideological battle that could turn into a physical battle very quickly. And part of his plan is we need to have alternative oil fuel resources.
Right.
We can't continue to depend on a part of the world that doesn't like us and
Right.
doesn't have our interests at heart.
It seems the quickest way to transfer American wealth out of our bank accounts is to rise the price of gasoline,
Sure.
and it shifts right to a bank account in a foreign country.
Right, and usually in a country that doesn't like us very well,
Yeah, exactly.
or share our values.
And you do know that 85% of the mosques in the United States are built and staffed by Saudi Arabia.
Right, the Wahhabis
The
or
Wahhabi
Wahhabis.
yeah.
version of
Right.
Islam, radical
Oh, yeah.
Islam.
Yeah, there's
And Sharia law is becoming almost acceptable.
right.
I mean, we tolerate things that we would never allow Christians or Jews to do in the United States in terms of prayer and in terms of encouraging the difference. And
Yeah, there's a real celebration of the differences we find in Islamic religious practice, whereas if Jews or Christians were to try to bring that into the public schools, it
Right.
it
Oh,
would
right.
be
Exactly.
gone immediately.
Also in the banking business, the Sharia compliant banking is a huge problem that nobody reads the fine print and knows really what Sharia compliant means. But in the banking world, it means that there's a panel of imams that supervise where the tithing, they call it tithing, because they can't collect interest.
Right, usury.
And they actually have the say-so of where this money goes. And in many cases it goes to support terrorist organizations.
Yeah, right. And I know it's being more and more popular in England and in Canada.
Right. Oh, indeed.
And they're trying definitely to come into America with this with this banking, and it's
Mhm.
being supported by the State Department.
Yeah.
They're actually
Isn't
having
that the Treasury Department?
the Treasury Department. Oh, okay, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's it doesn't surprise me
Yeah.
one bit when you see the trend of appeasement
Right.
that's happening in this country.
Absolutely.
Well, we're just going to wrap up now because we have just a few minutes left. So if you have something you want to promote or a website you want to close with.
Well, I would just like to say in closing that my friend Esther and I have had a great run. We've been working together. For many years there were Christian organizations that invited a few Jews in and Jewish organizations that had a few Christian friends, but what Esther had the vision for and what I've been privileged to help with is building a relationship that goes beyond the superficial. We've become friends at a level that we know each other, we can work together, and we keep looking over our shoulders to see if anyone's following, because that's what we want to do, is leave footprints in the sand to follow, because there's a battle going on. Her work with the Unity Coalition and the website is so important. I'm working in the field of Holocaust education. There's so many opportunities, but the people who do the work have the fun, and I really want to challenge the audience to participate. If you're in this area, join Vision, join Christians and Jews United for Israel, check with Pastor Tom Peets, who's heading up Kufi in Concord. There's tremendous opportunities, and we need to network and make a dent, because we can do it. That's what democracy is all about.
Can. Grassroots. Well, thank you, Esther, so much for joining us. Thank you for all the work you've done in Washington, bringing people together to help lobby Congress on behalf of Israel. And thank you, JoAnn, so much for all your work. And your reward is in heaven, all right, girls?
We have fun.
I would like to see some progress here. These are very dangerous times.
No doubt,
really.
no doubt. Well, I encourage you to check into those websites, and we're definitely privileged to have these iconic ladies join us here. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.